As mentioned in the previous clip, the Friend Organizer application is using a client-server architecture. So we have a WPF client and SQL Server as a database. I want to structure the client into 3 projects. One project for the user interface, one project for the data access logic, and one project containing the models. In the UI project, we will create the views with SAML. As we are going to use the MVVM pattern, we will also have the view models in our UI project. The view models are using data services to load data. A data service instance is passed to a view models constructor. This allows you to pass a fake data service to the view model when you want to write unit tests. In this course, we don't write any unit tests for the WPF client. But if you want to know how to test your view models, you can watch my course WPF and MVVM Test-Driven Development of View Models. So with the view model and the data service, we have the most important parts of the UI project. In the data access project, we will set up Entity Framework's DB context so that we can connect to SQL Server. The DB context is used by the data services of the UI project. In the model project, we will have our model classes, like for example the Friend class. Now let's set up the Friend Organizer solution with these 3 projects. In this demonstration, we will set up the Friend Organizer solution. In the previous clip, you learned that I want to create 3 projects. One for the user interface, one for the data access logic, and one for the models. So let's switch to Visual Studio and let's do this. Here I've opened Visual Studio 2017. Now let's create a new project. Let's start with the UI project. So here under Windows Classic Desktop, I select the WPF app. I give it the name friendorganizer.ui. And I want to call the solution just Friend Organizer. I also want to create a directory for my solution, so I keep this checkbox here checked. Okay, let's create the project. By default, the main Windows SAML file opens up. So let's just display the SAML code and let's enter as a title for the window Friend Organizer. Now I right-click on the solution to add the data access project. So let's create a new project of type class library. And I call that one friendorganizer.dataaccess. By default, the class library contains a class1 CS file. I just delete that file from my data access project. Now let's add the third project that will contain the model classes. It's also a class library and it gets the name friendorganizer.model. Here I have also a class1 CS file that gets opened by default. I just rename the class1 to friend. And now I can use the light bulb of Visual Studio by pressing Ctrl-. And I can rename the file to friend.cs. Now look in the Solution Explorer and you see the file has been renamed from class1.cs to friend.cs. I press Ctrl-. Again to remove these unnecessary usings. Now let's add some properties to that friend class. As we are going to use a database, the friend will have an ID. It will also have a first name and a last name and an email property. This is our model class. The last thing I want to do now, I want to set the references. So the data access project will reference the model project. The UI project will reference the data access project and the model project. That's it. Now we are done. We have the 3 projects UI, model and data access. Now let's wrap up what you have learned in this module before we build the basic user interface. Let's wrap up what you have learned in this module. You learned about n-tier architectures. We looked at a 3-tier architecture. In a 3-tier architecture, you can put security, logging and more stuff on the middle tier. When you have, for example, a REST service on the middle tier, you can have multiple clients accessing that service, including mobile clients. The Friend Organizer application is using a client-server architecture. Client-server means the client accesses the database directly. There is no middle tier. Client-server is not an anti-pattern. It's used quite often for internal applications. A big advantage of a client-server architecture with WPF and Entity Framework is that it allows you to control the lifetime of the Entity Framework DB context. Later in this course you will see that we keep the DB context alive for a single screen of the Friend Organizer application, so we can control what we want to send to the database when the user clicks the Save button on that screen. Beside the architectures, we have set up the Friend Organizer solution. We have a project for the user interface, for the data access logic, and for the models. Now let's continue and let's build a basic user interface for the Friend Organizer application. Welcome to the module Building the Basic UI Layer. My name is Thomas Claudius Huber, and in this module I want to build the first user interface for the Friend Organizer application together with you. But what's your opinion? Should we start without requirements? It might be a bit tough. So let's assume the required user interface looks like this. On the left side, we have a list of friends. The first name of each friend is displayed in this list. When the user selects a friend, the details are displayed on the right. That's it. Before we start, let's have a quick look at the module outline. We start this module by planning the user interface layer. Then we will ensure that you know the basics of the MVVM pattern. With this knowledge, we will create the different parts of the user interface of the Friend Organizer application. We will create a data service to load the data. We will create a view model that is using that data service, and we will create a view that binds to the properties of the view model. After we are done with this, we will even use dependency injection to inject the data service into the view model and to inject the view model into the view. Now let's start and let's plan the UI layer. In the previous module, we have structured our WPF client solution into 3 projects: a UI project, a data access project, and a model project. In this module, we focus on the UI project. We don't want to think about how we have to load the data from a database yet. We will do this in the next module. So let's forget about the database here, and so let's also forget about the data access project. But now the question is, where do we get the data from? The answer is quite simple. We will just implement a data service that returns fake data. In the next module, we can use Entity Framework in that data service to load data from a real database. With our implemented data service that returns fake data, we can use that data service in the view model, and we can bind the view to our view model. So we can build the full UI project. Before we look at the MVVM pattern to give you some details, let's switch to Visual Studio and let's set up the data service. Here I've opened the Friend Organizer solution. Now let's expand the UI project, let's right-click it, and let's add a new folder that we call Data. In that folder, we create the data service. So let's right-click the folder and let's say Add Class. As we want to load friends with our data service, I call the class Friend Data Service. Let's make the class public and let's add a public method that returns an IEnumerable of friend. I press Ctrl dot because I need a using for Friend Organizer model to use the friend class. So let's hit enter. I call the method getAll because I want to load all the friends. Here we don't access the database, instead I just use some yield statements to return a couple of friends. But let's add a to-do comment here. Later we want to load data from a real database. So now we are done with our data service. Let's remove these unused usings and let's extract an interface from that data service. I press Ctrl- again, extract interface, and I call the interface iFriendDataService, and the interface should have the getAll method. Here we go, we have an iFriendDataService interface that can be used by our view model. So now we have already our data service. Before we create the view model and the view, let's take a look at the MVVM pattern. The Model View ViewModel pattern, or short MVVM pattern, is a state-of-the-art pattern that is not only used in SAML-based applications. In MVVM you have a model, which is in our case the friend class with properties like first name and last name. You have a view model that is using that model. In the Friend Organizer application, the view model is using the data service that we have created in the previous clip to load the model. The view model's aim is to provide the data exactly in that way like it is required by the view. So for the Friend Organizer application, we will create a friends property in the view model so that we can bind to that property from the view. But to be able to bind to the properties of the view model, we need to assign the view model to the data context property of the view. Then every element in the view can bind to the properties of the view model. We will create a list view and we will bind its item source property to the friends property of the view model. So all the friends will be displayed in that list view. In the view model we will also create a selected friend property. We will bind the selected item property of the list view to that selected friend property. So whenever the user selects another friend in the list view, the selected friend property of the view model is set. As a friend has again properties like first name, we can for example create a text box and bind its text property to that first name property of the selected friend from the view model. The advantage of the MVVM pattern is that you split the view and the view logic. The view logic sits in the view model. This separation of view and view logic makes your application maintainable. As the view model is a UI-independent class, it's also great to use in unit tests. Now let's continue with the Friend Organizer application and let's create the different parts of the view model and of the view.